The photograph came back from space in the summer of 1967, and the analyst who spread it across his light table could not make it obey any rule he knew. He was looking at an object resting on the surface of the Caspian Sea. It was roughly 100 meters long. That single fact was already a problem, because 100 meters was longer than any aircraft that had ever been built, in any country, by anyone. And yet the thing had wings, short wings, stubby, blunt, truncated wings that looked far too small to lift a machine of that size into the air. So it could not be an aircraft, because those wings could never fly it. But it could not be a ship either, because ships did not have wings at all. It sat there in the grain of the film, throwing a faint wake of spray, enormous and patient and utterly wrong, a machine that fit no category in any reference book in Washington. The analyst did not have a name for it. Nobody did. And so, in the weeks that followed, somebody reached for the only word that captured the unease of looking at it. They called it a monster. Before we go any further into this story, I want to ask you for something small, because it genuinely matters. Cold War Impact is a small channel built around the hidden machines and the secret programs of the Cold War, the ones that never made the headlines, and the honest truth is that the reach on these videos has been sliding lately. If you find this kind of deep, careful history worth your time, the single most useful thing you can do is subscribe, leave a comment, and share this with someone who loves this era the way you do. Every one of those small actions tells the algorithm that this work deserves to be shown to other people, and that is what keeps these deep dives alive. Now let us go back to that impossible shape on the water, because to understand it, we first have to understand that it was not even the first monster the Americans found in that sea. There had been an earlier one. To grasp how badly the machine of 1967 unsettled American intelligence, you have to go back several years, to a different craft sitting on the very same coastline, and to one of the strangest fears of the entire nuclear age. Between roughly 1958 and 1961, American analysts had already picked out an odd shape near a dock on the Caspian shore. According to the account later written by the Central Intelligence Agency's own historian, Raymond Garthoff, in the agency's internal journal, that first object was fairly quickly identified. It was a reconfigured version of a well-known Soviet bomber, the big four-engined machine that the West called the Bear, modified with pontoons so that it could sit on the water. It was never once seen to fly, and because it was never seen to fly, it began to attract a very particular and very frightening theory. This was the era when both superpowers were chasing an idea that now sounds almost mad, the dream of a nuclear-powered aircraft. Not an aircraft carrying a nuclear bomb, which already existed, but an aircraft powered by a nuclear reactor in its belly, a machine that could in theory stay airborne for days or even weeks, circling endlessly, never needing to land for fuel. The United States was pouring money into exactly this dream, so when American analysts saw a strange modified bomber parked by the Caspian and never flying, some of them wondered whether the Soviets had solved the problem first. Whether that machine on the water was a flying laboratory built to test a reactor and its shielding. It became, in the careful language of intelligence, a program of interest, if not quite a formal suspect. The truth, as it turned out, lay elsewhere, and the real Soviet nuclear aircraft program was a separate effort entirely. The Soviets did build a genuine flying laboratory to carry a reactor aloft, a different modified Bear, and they did fly it with a reactor aboard in the summer of 1961, though the reactor did not power the plane. It merely rode along so that engineers could study how to shield a crew from its radiation. And that, precisely, was the wall that both nations slammed into. Shielding a human crew from a reactor sitting a few meters behind them, without making the aircraft too heavy to fly, proved to be a problem that money and ambition could not solve. In the United States, President Kennedy finally killed the American program in the spring of 1961. In his own words, announced that March, nearly 15 years and about $1 billion had been devoted to the attempted development of a nuclear-powered aircraft, and the possibility of ever achieving a militarily useful machine was still very remote. Both dreams died at almost the same moment. on both sides of the world. And here is the quiet twist that closes that first chapter. When American analysts later went back and reconsidered that original Caspian shape, the modified bomber on its pontoons, they concluded it had never been a nuclear testbed at all. It had most likely been an early and unsuccessful attempt to build a large machine that skimmed the water, a false start, a dead end. In Garthoff's blunt final verdict, the original Caspian sea monster had never even been in the game. The fear had been a phantom, but the nickname, that ominous, evocative nickname, did not die with the phantom. It sat waiting on that coastline, and when something genuinely monstrous appeared in the same waters a few years later, it simply inherited the name that the first machine had left behind. Two monsters, one haunted sea, and only the second one was real. So now we can return to that photograph of 1967 and understand why it caused such a stir, and to do that we have to talk about how the Americans were even able to see it at all. This was one of the most closed and secretive bodies of water on Earth, a sea ringed almost entirely by Soviet territory, watched over by Soviet security, a place where no Western ship could sail up for a closer look, and no Western reporter could wander the shore. For a few years in the late 1950s, the United States had been able to fly a high-altitude spy plane, the U-2, straight over Soviet territory to photograph such places. But that door had slammed shut in 1960, when the Soviets shot one of those aircraft out of the sky and paraded its captured pilot in front of the world. After that, overflying the Soviet Union with a piloted aircraft was simply too dangerous and too provocative. The eyes that found the monster were not in an airplane at all, they were in orbit. This is worth being precise about, because the popular version of this story often gets it wrong. You will sometimes hear that a U-2 spy plane first spotted the Caspian Sea monster. That cannot be right, for the simple reason that by 1967, those flights over Soviet soil had long since ended. The machine that actually found it was a reconnaissance satellite. According to the official history written by the National Reconnaissance Office, the American organization that built and ran these spy satellites, the discovery came mostly from the imagery of a program code named Gambit. Gambit was the high-resolution eye in the sky, the close-look system, a satellite whose cameras could be pointed with great precision at a single target to capture fine detail. It worked in partnership with a second, wider system that swept enormous areas of the Earth to decide what was worth a closer look. Together, one system asked how many, and the other asked what exactly. And somewhere in that patient orbital watch, the cameras caught a vast, unfamiliar object sitting at a Soviet research facility on the Caspian coast, near a town called Kaspisk. The film these satellites captured did not simply appear on a screen for someone to glance at. In this era, the cameras shot onto physical film, and that film had to be brought back down to Earth, dropped from orbit in protective capsules, recovered, developed, and then pored over by trained specialists at a place called the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington, an organization that had grown to more than 1,000 people drawn from the intelligence agencies and the military services. These photo interpreters were the human beings who actually looked at the pictures and tried to wring meaning out of them. It was painstaking, unglamorous, brilliant work. They had techniques honed over years. They could magnify the negatives many times over, studying a target at a scale that revealed astonishing detail. They could measure an object with real precision by studying the shadows it cast across the ground, or the water, using the known angle of the sun to calculate an object's height and length from the length of its shadow alone. The people who did this work were among the most skilled interpreters of imagery who had ever lived, the inheritors of a craft that reached back to the aerial photographs of the world wars. And this particular object on the Caspian defeated them, at least at first, because everything about it contradicted everything else. The engines were the first puzzle. On any normal aircraft, the engines are placed on or under the wings, or at the tail, arranged to work with the wing that lifts the machine. On this object, a whole cluster of engines sat far forward, up near the nose, well ahead of those strange short wings, as if bolted on in the wrong place by someone who did not understand how airplanes worked. The wings were the second puzzle, and the deeper one. They were simply too small. Every instinct and every calculation said that a wing that short could not generate the lift required to fly a machine that massive. And so the interpreters reached a reasonable and completely wrong conclusion. They assumed the thing could not be finished. They assumed they were looking at an incomplete hull, a machine still under construction, something that would eventually sprout the proper wings it needed. They believed they had time to watch it grow. They did not yet understand that they were looking at a machine that was already complete, already flying, and already breaking a rule of flight they had not thought to apply. The desperation to understand it ran deep enough that, according to a former agency officer, the Central Intelligence Agency even explored a remarkable scheme to get a closer look. In the mid-1960s, it funded a secret project to build a tiny reconnaissance drone, a machine roughly the size and shape of a large bird, with a wingspan of just a few feet, powered by a small engine that might be flown in low to photograph difficult targets from close range. One of the stated purposes behind that little mechanical bird, in the recollection of that officer, was to sneak up on the giant multi-engined watercraft that the satellites had found on the Caspian and finally see it up close. That drone program was eventually cancelled, years later, when its costs spiraled. I should be careful here and tell you plainly that the link between that drone and this specific machine rests largely on that one officer's account, rather than on hard documentation, so treat it as a colourful piece of the story, rather than a settled fact. But it captures something true about the mood. The Americans were so unnerved by the shape on the water that they were willing to consider sending a robotic bird across the world to photograph it. The answer to the whole mystery, when it finally came together, was not a secret weapon in the way anyone had feared. It was a piece of physics. A trick of the air that hides just above every flat surface in the world, a trick that most people have felt without ever once noticing it. Here is how it works. When an ordinary wing moves through open sky, it does not simply push air down and hold the aircraft up for free. Off the tips of the wing, and behind it, the air curls into great spinning vortices, invisible whirlpools of wasted energy that trail the machine and drag it backward. This wasted, drag-inducing swirl is one of the heaviest taxes in all of flight, and every aircraft ever built pays it on every second of every journey. But something remarkable happens when a wing flies very low, close to the ground or close to the water, within roughly the length of its own wingspan of the surface. The surface physically gets in the way of those spinning vortices. It blocks them, interrupts them, and prevents them from fully forming. The whirlpools shrink, the wasted drag collapses, and the lift rises. The wing suddenly becomes far more efficient than it has any right to be, as if it were resting on a firm, invisible cushion of its own trapped air, a pad of dense high pressure squeezed between the underside of the wing and the surface racing by below. Pilots have known this sensation for as long as there have been airplanes. In the final seconds before touchdown, an aircraft often seems to float, to hang, to refuse to settle onto the runway, as if the ground itself were gently pushing back up against it. That floating is ground effect, and for most pilots it is a minor quirk to be managed in the last moments of a landing. But a small number of engineers looked at that same everyday phenomenon and saw something revolutionary hiding inside it. They asked a heretical question. What if you did not fight the floating at all? What if you built a machine designed to live inside that cushion permanently? A machine that never climbed away from the surface, but instead raced across it just a few meters up, riding forever on that dense pad of captured air. Such a machine could be gigantic, because the cushion would help hold up weight that would cripple a normal aircraft. It could carry colossal loads. It could move at the speed of an airplane while burning only a fraction of the fuel a true airplane would need to move the same mass. It would not be a ship, and it would not be a plane. It would be a third kind of thing. The Russians built a word for it. They called it the ekranoplan, which means, roughly, the screen glider, a machine that flies upon the screen of the surface itself. And the man who dragged this idea out of theory and into steel was not an aircraft designer at all. He was a builder of boats. His name was Rostislav Alexeyev, and he was born in December of 1916 into a country that was about to tear itself apart in revolution and civil war. He trained as a shipbuilding engineer, and he completed his degree in the autumn of 1941, in the desperate opening months of the German invasion, with a graduation project devoted to a boat that rose up on underwater wings. This was the hydrofoil, a craft fitted with blade-like fins beneath the hull that generate lift as the boat gathers speed, raising the entire hull clear of the water to slash the drag and let the vessel fly across the surface on its little submerged wings. Alexeyev was gripped by the problem of speed on water for his entire life, and the hydrofoil was his first great love. Assigned to a major shipyard in the city of Gorky, a closed industrial city on the Volga that foreigners were forbidden to enter, he was tasked during the war with trying to develop fast hydrofoil combat boats. Those wartime boats were not finished in time to fight, but the state's interest in his work survived the war, and it gave him a foundation to build on. What he built, in the years that followed, changed how millions of Soviet citizens traveled. In the late 1950s, he produced a sleek passenger hydrofoil named the Raketa, the rocket, and it was a sensation. Its first real voyage, in the late summer of 1957, carried 30 passengers hundreds of kilometers up the Volga at 3 times the speed of the slow displacement riverboats that people were used to. Over the years that followed, more than 300 Raketas were built and sent out across the rivers and lakes of the Soviet Union, and they were exported to more than a dozen countries. He followed the Raketa with an even larger craft, the Meteor, which could carry over 100 passengers, and which became the most widely produced hydrofoil the world has ever seen, with more than 400 built. He designed a whole family of these winged ships, with names like the Comet, the Sputnik, the Volga, and the Burevestnik, until fast hydrofoils crisscrossed the entire Soviet Union, carrying millions of people a year. For this work, Alexeyev collected the highest honors the state could bestow, including the Lenin Prize. He had become to fast boats what the great aircraft designers were to fast planes, a national figure, a bureau chief with his own design house and his own devoted team. But the hydrofoil had a ceiling, a hard wall built into the physics, and Alexeyev could see it coming. Push a boat fast enough on its underwater blades, and the water itself begins to tear and boil against the metal fins, a violent process that erodes and destroys the very surfaces holding the craft up. There was a speed beyond which the hydrofoil simply could not go, and Alexeyev understood that if he truly wanted to go faster, he could not stay in the water at all. He had to leave it entirely. He had to fly, but he did not want to fly the way airplanes flew, high and thirsty and fragile. He wanted to fly the way a flung stone skips across a pond, low and flat and blindingly fast, kissing the surface without ever truly leaving it. He wanted to build a ship that flew on that cushion of trapped air, and in the political weather of the early 1960s, he found the one patron in the entire Soviet system who was perfectly built to fall in love with such an audacious dream. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, adored bold machines and grand gestures. Before Alexeyev could win that support, though, he had to prove the idea could work at all, and he did it the way he did everything, by building smaller machines and testing them himself, often at the controls in person. Through the early 1960s, his bureau produced a series of experimental craft, each one a stepping stone. The very first, a modest machine, lifted off the water under his own hand in the summer of 1961, and promptly taught him how treacherous this new kind of flight could be. During one test, it climbed higher than it should have, rose out of the protective cushion, and then dropped through the air and struck the ice below when the power was cut, damaging the craft and rattling its crew. It was an early, sharp lesson. This machine wanted to fly, but it had to be kept low, disciplined, and held down against its own instinct to climb into a region where it could not survive. The next craft in the series was the one that mattered for the future, because it introduced Alexeyev's cleverest trick, and because it caught the eye of the premier himself. On this machine, he mounted an engine at the nose that could blow a blast of air directly underneath the wing, artificially inflating the cushion to help heave the craft up onto its pad of air in the first place. In the spring of 1962, He demonstrated this machine to Khrushchev and the Soviet leadership. By the accounts that survive, the little craft did not perform flawlessly on the day. There is a much repeated story, told in Russian language histories and worth passing along with that caution attached, that during a demonstration flight around this period, one of the craft ran out of fuel and stranded a senior official on the water until it could be refueled and coaxed back to shore, prompting a grumbled complaint that the thing could barely clear a telegraph pole. Whether or not every detail of that tale is exact, the essential outcome is well documented. Imperfect as the demonstration was, the sheer audacity of the concept seized Khrushchev's imagination. Here was a machine that could skim across the sea faster than any warship, low enough to slip beneath enemy radar, big enough one day to carry soldiers and weapons and missiles. Khrushchev is said to have boasted that the Soviet Union now had boats that could jump over bridges. In the West, that remark was filed away as the usual bluster. It was not bluster. The funding valves opened. Powerful figures in the defense establishment and the Navy threw their weight behind the idea, and Alexeyev received an extraordinary instruction. Build it at full size. Not another model. The real thing. The largest machine that had ever left the ground. Not every step along the way was survivable. Building toward that full-sized giant, his bureau constructed scaled-down analogues to test the design, and one of them, a quarter-sized version of the machine to come, was lost in a fatal accident. Caught by a gust that flung it up out of ground effect, the craft stalled when its crew responded with full power instead of easing off, and it struck the water hard enough to kill the men aboard. It was the first time this radical new kind of flight had taken a life. It would not be the last. Every one of these machines carried, buried in its design, the same lethal paradox that had nearly claimed the very first prototype. They were built to hug the surface, and if they ever climbed too high, they entered a realm where their stubby wings could not sustain them, and they fell. What Alexeyev's bureau finally built, between roughly 1964 and 1966, defied belief. It stretched about 92 meters from nose to tail. Its wingspan reached around 37 meters, and those wings were short and broad and thick, nothing like the long, graceful spans of an airliner. Fully loaded, the machine weighed in the neighborhood of 544 tons. To put that number in the plainest possible terms, it weighed nearly twice as much as a Boeing 747 jumbo jet, and at the moment of its creation, no 747 had even flown yet. This single experimental machine was, when it was built, the largest and heaviest flying object that human beings had ever made. It would hold that title for more than 20 years. Nothing on Earth would surpass it until the Soviets rolled out their gigantic Antonov cargo plane at the very end of the 1980s, and by then, Alexeyev's monster was already dead. To lift and drive that colossus, Alexeyev hung 10 jet engines on it. These were heavy Dobrynin turbojets, from the same family that powered a Soviet strategic bomber. 8 of them were clustered in 2 groups just behind the cockpit, and here was the payoff of the trick he had tested on the smaller craft. On takeoff, the exhaust from those 8 forward engines could be angled downward, blasting a torrent of air beneath the wings to inflate the cushion and heave the enormous hull up out of the clinging water. Once the machine was up and racing on its own captured air, that downward blast was no longer needed, and 2 more engines mounted high near the tail pushed it along in cruising flight. 10 engines on a single machine. It is hard to overstate how blunt and direct that solution was. If the physics demanded raw, brute thrust to break the grip of the sea, then Alexeyev would supply raw, brute thrust in overwhelming abundance, and let elegance take care of itself later. The machine was given a name, or really just a plain engineering label. Painted on its hull were 2 Russian letters that transliterate into our alphabet as K and M. They stood for 2 Russian words meaning, roughly, ship prototype, or model ship, a modest and honest designation for what was, after all, an experimental test article. And here we have to confront one of the most beloved stories in this entire subject, because it is a wonderful story and it appears to be false. The popular telling goes that American analysts saw those 2 letters on the hull, KM, and decided they must stand for Caspian Monster, and that this is the very origin of the famous nickname. It is repeated endlessly, but according to the Central Intelligence Agency's own historian, the one who actually wrote up the episode in the agency's internal journal, the name did not come from the letters at all. It came from where the craft was found and from how it looked, and it had in fact been handed down from that earlier Phantom, the modified bomber on pontoons that had spooked analysts years before. The letters and the legend make a tidy tale. The truth is quieter and, in its own way, stranger, which is how these things so often turn out to be. Simply getting the finished giant from its factory to the sea was an act of enormous secrecy. It was built at a shipyard on the Volga, deep inside the closed city, and in the summer of 1966, it had to be floated down the river to the Caspian for testing. The Soviets removed the wings, wrapped the vast hull in a wooden casing to hide its true shape, and moved it only under cover of darkness, a giant disguised thing creeping down the river at night, so that no observer, from the riverbank or from the sky, could see clearly what was passing them in the dark. When it finally reached the test grounds on the coast, the crews reassembled it and prepared to discover whether Alexiev's heresy would actually fly. On the 16th of October, 1966, it did. The test pilot at the controls was named Vladimir Loginov, and beside him, breaking one of the ironclad rules of Soviet aviation, sat Alexiev himself. Chief designers did not ride in their own untested experimental machines. It was considered a needless gamble with an irreplaceable mind, the kind of loss a program could not absorb. Alexiev did not care. This was his creation, the work of his life scaled up to monstrous proportions, and he intended to feel with his own body whether it flew true. The machine thundered across the water, its forward engines screaming, the cushion building beneath the wings, and then the enormous hull broke free of the sea and settled into that strange, low, skimming flight, racing just a few meters above the surface. In its trials, it reached speeds of hundreds of kilometers an hour, with an operational pace in the range of 500 kilometers an hour. A machine of 500 tons, moving at the speed of a propeller airliner, skimming the sea so low and so smoothly that from any distance it seemed to be a part of the water itself. It worked. The screen glider was real, and it was gigantic. And this, at last, is the machine that ended up spread across that American analyst's light table in the summer of 1967. Now every contradiction in that baffling photograph resolves into sense. Of course, the wings looked far too short to fly, because they were never meant to fly in the open sky, only to trap air against the surface of the sea. Of course, the engines were bunched up near the nose, because that was exactly where they needed to be to blast the cushion into existence beneath the wings. Of course, the machine sat on the water like a ship, because when it was not racing across the surface, a ship was very nearly what it was. The Americans had photographed a category of machine that did not exist anywhere in their imagination, and it took years of patient work, more images, more flights caught from orbit, before the picture finally came clear. By the late 1960s, American intelligence had reasoned out the essential truth. This was not a bomber, and not a transport plane in any ordinary sense. It was a surface effect machine, a craft built to ride the cushion of the ground, and the Soviets, the analysts realized, appeared to be building more than one kind of them. Here is the irony that sits at the dead center of this entire story, and it is worth holding on to as we go forward, because everything that follows bends around it. The very quality that made the monster so terrifying when it was first seen from space, its refusal to fit any known category, its alien wrongness, was the exact same quality that would eventually doom it. The things that baffled the analysts were not the fingerprints of an unstoppable superweapon. They were the fingerprints of a machine chained to the surface of the water, bound to it, unable to rise above it, and that chain was far shorter and far heavier than anyone in the Soviet military wanted to admit out loud. But that reckoning was still years in the future. For now, in the late 1960s and on into the 1970s, the Ekranoplan looked like the shining future of Soviet naval power, and the military set out to turn Alexiev's flying prototype into real weapons of war. The logic was seductive. If a machine could skim beneath enemy radar at the speed of an aircraft, while carrying the heavy load of a ship, immune to the sea mines and the torpedoes, and the lurking submarines that threatened every ordinary vessel, then it could do things nothing else could do. It could rush an assault force of Marines onto a hostile beach before the defenders even understood an attack was underway. It could haul missiles far out to sea and strike at the greatest naval prize of the age, the American aircraft carrier, before the carrier's escorts could react. The Soviets chased both of those dreams, and each one produced a real, flying machine. The first was a troop carrier, and they named it the Orleanok, which means the eaglet. It was smaller than the original monster, though still an enormous machine, roughly the size of a large airliner. It was driven by a powerful turboprop engine mounted high at the junction of its tail, from the same engine family that powered the Soviet Union's famous long-range bomber, assisted by 2 jet engines set in the nose to build its takeoff cushion. The Orleanok was genuinely amphibious. It could ride up onto a beach on its own retractable landing gear, and it had a remarkable and slightly theatrical trick. Its entire nose, the whole front section of the machine including the cockpit, swung to one side on a giant hinge, opening the craft up like a door so that Marines and armored vehicles could roll straight out through the front on a built-in ramp. It could carry a large force of fully equipped troops, or heavy vehicles such as armored personnel carriers, and deliver them across the sea and directly onto enemy sand at hundreds of kilometers an hour. Unlike the original monster, the Orleanok could even haul itself a little way up out of ground effect when it absolutely had to, hopping briefly higher to clear an obstacle before dropping back down to its cushion. The Orleanok is also where we find the single most telling human moment in Alexiev's whole story, an episode that reveals both the toughness of his machines and the cruelty of the system he served. During the testing of the prototype in the mid-1970s, the craft had at some earlier point struck a sandbar hard enough to crack its metal hull in ways that nobody noticed at the time. Later, on a landing in rough water, the weakened structure gave way, and the entire rear section of the aircraft, the whole tail together with the main engine, broke clean off and sank into the sea. Alexiev was aboard, once again riding in his own machine against the rules. He looked out from an upper hatch, understood in an instant what had happened, and without a word, he took over the controls. He fed full power to the nose engines, and, using the blast beneath the wing to keep the crippled, tail-less machine planing across the surface, he drove it something like 40 kilometers back to base. Only when they were safely home did the crew fully grasp that they had been flying a machine with no tail. Alexiev had just proven, with his own hands and his own life on the line, that his creation was tough enough to survive catastrophic damage and still be brought home. You might expect a medal for that. Instead, the military leadership turned the incident against him. He was blamed rather than praised, and the accident became part of the case for stripping him of his authority as chief designer. A handful of Orleanoks were built, only a few of them fully operational flying machines, and they entered service with the Soviet Navy toward the end of the 1970s. They were operated by a special naval unit based at Kaspiysk on the Caspian, flown by pilots who had mostly come from flying boats and naval amphibians, and over time they were folded formally into naval aviation. Their service was troubled and short. One of the machines was lost in a crash in the early 1990s, again following that same deadly pattern: a sudden pitch, an overcorrection, a climb, a stall, and a fall into the sea, with the loss of one crew member and the survival of the rest. The wreck drifted for a great distance and was eventually destroyed because the cash-starved navy of the new Russia could not even afford to salvage it. The grand plans, which had once called for a whole fleet of these eaglets and a second operating unit in the Baltic, quietly evaporated. But one Orleanok survives to this day, preserved at a naval museum near Moscow, its strange hinged nose frozen forever, mid-swing for visitors to walk past and struggle to believe. The second machine born from the program was the true nightmare, the one that Cold War planners on both sides would have lost sleep over had they fully understood what it was meant to do. They named it the Loon, a Russian word for a bird of prey, a kind of Harrier that hunts low over open ground. Where the Orleanoc carried men, the Loon carried missiles, and it existed for one single, focused purpose: to kill ships, to kill the largest and most valuable ships in the world. It was nearly as long as the original monster, around 73 meters, and it was driven by 8 jet engines mounted together on the forward part of the fuselage. Those engines were placed forward quite deliberately, so that their intakes would not swallow the searing exhaust of the weapons the machine carried. Because along its broad back, arranged in launch tubes, the Lun carried 6 of the most feared anti-ship missiles the Soviet Union ever built. Those missiles deserve a moment of their own, because they are the entire reason the Lun was so lethal. Each one was a large supersonic weapon that could scream toward its target at well over twice the speed of sound, then drop down in its final approach to skim just a few meters above the wavetops, riding in low and impossibly fast. A missile like that gave a defending warship almost no time to respond. Where an older, slower subsonic missile might grant a couple of minutes of warning, a weapon of this kind could compress a crew's entire reaction window down to something on the order of half a minute. Barely enough time to understand that death was inbound, let alone to stop it. Each missile carried a warhead heavy enough to gut a large vessel, and the design could be fitted with a nuclear charge as well. Now imagine the delivery system for such a weapon. The Lun would come racing in low and fast beneath the enemy's radar horizon, a 500-kilometer-an-hour ghost skimming the surface of the sea, and salvo its missiles in a matter of seconds before wheeling away. A single Lun could cripple a carrier. A formation of them could annihilate an entire battle group. This was the Soviet answer to American command of the oceans, an asymmetric ambush machine that used the surface of the sea itself as its cover. To understand why the Soviets invested in something so exotic, you have to understand the man who shaped their navy and the problem he was trying to solve. For nearly 30 years, from the mid-1950s into the mid-1980s, the Soviet fleet was led by Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, who took a force built mainly for coastal defense and submarines and pushed it out onto the open oceans of the world to challenge the West. He was ambitious and blunt about it. He once warned, in effect, that the flag of the Soviet Navy now flew proudly over the oceans of the world, and that sooner or later the United States would have to accept that it no longer held sole mastery of the seas. But for all that ambition, the Soviet Navy could never realistically hope to match the United States, carrier for carrier. Those American carriers, with their nuclear-armed strike aircraft, could threaten the Soviet homeland from positions far out at sea, from the Norwegian Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Sea of Japan, and the central obsession of Soviet naval planning was finding a way to sink them before they could launch their aircraft. The answer the Soviets settled on was not to build matching carriers of their own, but to saturate the enemy with fast, low-flying supersonic anti-ship missiles fired from many different platforms all at once, overwhelming a carrier group's layered defenses through sheer speed and sheer numbers. A defending fleet might stop one missile, or 5, but the Soviet theory was to send so many, so fast, and so low, that some fraction was mathematically certain to get through. Submarines would fire them from beneath the surface. Bombers would fire them from the air. Fast missile boats would fire them from the surface. And the missile-carrying Loon, darting through the confined waters of the Black Sea, the Baltic, and the Caspian, was meant to be one more platform bringing that saturating firepower to bear, a platform that combined the speed of an aircraft with the heavy missile load of a warship. Gorshkov himself acknowledged the promise of these ground-effect machines, noting that they offered greater speed and greater operational range than conventional surface ships, even while admitting, with a soldier's honesty, that the experience of actually building and operating them was still thin, and the technical problems still only partly understood. Only one complete Lun was ever finished. It was launched onto the Volga in the summer of 1986, and eventually joined the fleet on the Caspian, where it underwent its trials, including the live firing of its missiles, around the turn of the decade. It was never truly, fully combat-ready in the way a warship is meant to be, and its fundamental limitation was the same curse that hung over every machine in the program. It could only operate in calm water, and it could not climb away from trouble. A second loon was begun, and partway through its construction its purpose was changed. After a Soviet nuclear submarine sank with terrible loss of life at the end of the 1980s, the half-built second machine was redesigned to become a flying rescue ship, a kind of mobile hospital that could race to a disaster at sea and treat hundreds of survivors. It was never finished. History overtook it, and it was left sitting incomplete in its shed, where it largely remains. While the military dreamed of fleets of these machines patrolling the seas, the man who had created all of it was being ground down by the very institution he served. Alexiev's fall followed a pattern that anyone who has studied the fate of Soviet visionaries will recognize with a sinking familiarity. The tail-less flight that should have made him a hero was used instead to justify removing him from the leadership of the bureau he had founded. Step by step, he was demoted and pushed toward the margins of his own creation, until a man who had reshaped Soviet transport and invented an entire class of machine found himself reduced nearly to the status of an ordinary employee. And his end came quickly on the heels of his fall. In January of 1980, he was personally involved, as he always insisted on being, in the testing of a new passenger version of his flying ship, when the craft dropped hard onto the water and he suffered a severe internal injury. He was hospitalized, endured 2 operations, and died a few weeks later, in February of 1980, at the age of 63. He did not live to see what became of his machines, and in a cruel piece of symmetry, the great original monster itself, that 92-meter giant that had baffled the world from orbit, outlived its creator by only a matter of months. That machine met its end later the same year, and the cause was heartbreakingly ordinary. It was not shot down. It was not lost to some exotic failure of its radical design. It was lost to a simple mistake on takeoff, the very same trap that had killed the crew of the quarter-sized test craft years earlier. During the launch, the nose was raised too steeply, the angle grew too sharp, and instead of adding power to push through it, the crew let the power fall away. The machine lost its lift, rolled, and struck the water hard. The crew survived and got clear. The monster did not. It was far too heavy to salvage, and it floated for about a week, wallowing in the Caspian like a dying whale, before it finally slipped beneath the surface and sank to the bottom, where it remains to this day. The largest flying machine on Earth, undone not by an enemy and not by the limits of physics, but by a few seconds of mishandled controls on a routine test. There was no replacement waiting. The one and only original was gone for good. With both of the forces that had driven the whole enterprise now removed, Alexiev dead, and his great prototype resting on the seabed, the deeper weaknesses of the entire concept could no longer be waved away or shouted down. For all its power to terrify from above, the Ekranoplan was, at its core, a prisoner of the surface it flew on. That cushion of trapped air that made the whole thing possible only worked when the machine flew extremely low, and flying that low, always, came at a savage price. The sea is not a flat and cooperative table. When the waves rose beyond a fairly modest height, the cushion became unreliable and dangerous, and the machine that ruled a calm sea became useless in a real ocean swell. These giants could not simply climb up and over bad weather the way an aircraft could, because climbing was the one thing they were built never to do. They were made to hug the surface, and so they were held hostage to the moods of that surface. They could barely maneuver, turning slowly and ponderously in a way that would have been suicidal in the fast, chaotic combat they were supposedly designed to dominate. The constant salt spray chewed relentlessly at their engines. They were fantastically expensive to build and to maintain, and the one body of water where they could operate most freely, the Caspian, was a landlocked sea ringed almost entirely by Soviet soil, which said something quietly damning about how far these machines could ever really reach in a real war. The strategic doubts piled up alongside the technical ones. Khrushchev, the great original patron, had been pushed out of power all the way back in 1964, and the leaders who followed him had far less appetite for such exotic and expensive gambles. The single most important defender of the program within the Defense Ministry died in the mid-1980s, and the leadership that came after him made a decisive choice. Scarce naval money would flow to submarines, quiet and deep and genuinely global in a way the surface-skimming ekranoplan could never be. The flying ships began to look less like the future and more like a beautiful and costly detour. And then the ground gave way beneath the entire enterprise. The Soviet Union itself came apart at the beginning of the 1990s, and when it did, the flood of military money that had sustained the whole program simply stopped, all at once. There would be no fleets of monsters skimming the world's seas. The dream ended, not in a battle, but in an empty treasury and a country that had ceased to exist. The machines that survived slipped into a strange and quiet afterlife. For years, the single-completed Loon, the great missile carrier, sat retired and slowly rusting at a naval base on the Caspian, a secret weapon that the wider world had barely ever glimpsed, being eaten alive by the salt air. And then, in the summer of 2020, it was hauled out for one last voyage. The plan was to make it the centerpiece of a military museum park on the coast at the ancient city of Derbent. Moving it turned into an ordeal worthy of the machine itself. Crews lashed it to great rubber pontoons and towed it slowly along the coastline behind tugboats, a crawl of many hours across open water, and then, agonizingly, near the very end, it ran aground short of its destination, stranded in the shallows where the surf could batter its hull. For months, this fearsome relic of the Cold War sat beached on the sand, tilted and exposed, while curious visitors picked their way out across the shallows to stand in its shadow and photograph it up close. The monster at last held still enough to touch. Eventually it was dragged fully ashore, and in the years since, crews have worked to repair the damage and restore it, building the museum up around it, so that this last survivor of Alexiev's vision might be seen by people who will struggle to believe it was ever real, or that it ever flew. You might reasonably think that would be the end of it, a machine for a museum, a strange dead branch of engineering history, and nothing more. But the odd and stubborn idea at the heart of it all has never quite died, and the reason is simple. The physics that Alexiev exploited is exactly as true today as it was in 1966. That cushion of air is still there, hiding above every flat surface in the world, still offering the same tempting bargain of speed and heavy lifting to anyone willing to fly low enough to claim it. And in the years since the Soviet fall, the idea has kept resurfacing, in one nation's hands after another. In modern Russia, the design bureau that still carries Alexiev's name has spent years talking about new and smaller ekranoplans, both civilian and military. One much-discussed design is a mid-sized multi-purpose craft meant to carry passengers or cargo over long distances, shown as models and mock-ups at exhibitions and promised for flight tests that have repeatedly slipped further into the future. There have been announcements, too, of intentions to build a new combat ekranoplan carrying missiles folded into Russia's long-range armament plans. But as of now, none of these machines has actually entered service. The talk has been real. The finished, flying, operational machines have not, at least not yet. Elsewhere, though, the idea has taken flesh again. In the summer of 2025, an open-source naval analyst studying satellite and photographic imagery identified a large new ground effect machine being tested off the coast of China, near the Bohai Sea. He gave it a name that wrote itself, drawing a deliberate line straight back across half a century to the Soviet original. He called it the Bohai Sea Monster. Early assessments of the craft have been refined as clearer images emerged, revealing a substantial flying boat hull, a distinctive tail, and, in later photographs, hard points under the wings suggesting it could carry weapons. Analysts believe its most likely purpose is fast military logistics, rapidly resupplying and reinforcing the scattered island outposts that China has built across the contested waters of the Western Pacific. Another great power, it seems, has looked again at the possibility of flying low and fast and heavy across the sea, and decided it is worth pursuing after all. Even the United States circled back to the concept, and its recent experience is perhaps the most fitting epilogue of all. A few years ago, the American military's Advanced Research Agency launched a program to build a modern flying boat that would use ground effect to haul enormous cargoes across the ocean, a cheaper and lower-flying answer to the old problem of moving heavy loads over vast distances. The agency brought in serious aerospace companies, competed rival designs against one another, and studied the problem hard, running the simulations and testing the materials and the manufacturing methods. And the engineers reached a clear conclusion: the physics genuinely works. You really can build such a machine, one capable of taking off and landing even in rough seas. And then, in the middle of 2025, having spent something close to $100 million, proving the idea was fundamentally sound, the agency chose not to build the flying demonstrator after all, and closed the program down. The program's manager summed it up in words that Alexeyev himself might have appreciated. They had learned, he said, that they could build such a craft, and that the physics made sense. The trouble, as the agency's director explained afterward, was in everything that surrounded the physics, in the stubborn difficulty of marrying the way you build a ship to the way you certify an aircraft, in 100 practical problems that turned out to be harder than anyone had expected. The physics, as ever, was never the problem. And that is the quiet, durable lesson buried in the whole story of the Caspian Sea monster. The machine that baffled the analysts from space was never a trick, and never a fraud. It flew exactly as it was designed to fly, and nearly everything those interpreters eventually deduced about it turned out to be true. It really could carry the weight of a warship at the speed of an airplane. It really could slip in beneath the radar and strike without meaningful warning. The engineering was sound, the vision was genuine, and, in its way, brilliant. What defeated the Ekranoplan was never the impossibility of the idea, because the idea was entirely possible. What defeated it was everything gathered around the idea, a machine so narrowly specialized that it could only thrive on calm water and could never rise above its own reflection. A designer too stubborn and too hands-on to survive the politics of the system he served, ridden down by the very institution his genius had enriched. A patron who lost his grip on power, and a chain of successors who lost interest in the dream. And in the end, a country that dissolved before it could ever build the fleet it had imagined. The men who first stared at that impossible photograph were right to be unsettled by it, and right, in the final accounting, to sense that a machine so strange must carry weaknesses as deep as its strengths. The monster rests now on the floor of the Caspian. Its last armed sibling stands in the sun at a half-built museum on a distant shore, and its central idea drifts on, quietly, from one ambitious nation to the next, still whispering the same offer it once whispered to a boat builder from Gorky more than half a century ago. Fly low enough, and the surface itself will hold you up. Somewhere, right now, someone is being tempted to try it again.